Alright guys, so in the last video we looked at many of the properties available on the document object, including properties that allowed us to select elements from the DOM in the form of HTML collections. Now in this video we're going to look at a much more common and practical way to select elements. And the methods that we're going to use here are to select single elements on the page. So if you want to get, let's say, all of the paragraphs on the page, you wouldn't use these methods. We're going to look at those in the next video, methods to select multiple elements. For this is like if I wanted to select this particular H1 or this particular input, then we would use these methods. All right, so the first one has been around for a while, and it's going to be document.getElement by ID. So basically it does just that. It'll allow us to get any element in the DOM by its ID. So if we look at, let's see, if we look at the Elements tab here and in the Dev Tools, you'll see that this H1 has an ID of app title. So I want to get that. Let's go ahead and we'll do a console log of it first. So document.getElement by ID, and it has an ID of app-title. So if I were to log that in the console, we're going to see that H1. Now there's going to be cases where you want to get a specific attribute. So what we could do is there are properties available such as ID, and there is an ID on this element, so I could just add on .id. Now that doesn't work for every single attribute. For instance, if I do .class, I get undefined. And I know there isn't actually a class on here, but I'll show you real quick. If I were to add a class onto this H1 of, say, hello, if I do that, we still get undefined because class is not a property. Now there is a class name property, and you'll see that does get it. But that's not always going to be the case. Get rid of that. So what you can do is use a method called getAttribute. So I'm going to copy this down, and instead of this .class name, I'm going to say .getAttribute, and that's a method. So it takes parentheses, and then we can pass in whatever attribute we want. I'll pass in ID, and you'll see now we get app title. Now there's going to be cases where you want to set attributes, not just get them. So there's a few ways to do that. So one is to grab the element. So let's say app-title. And let's say I wanted to change the ID. I could say .id and set that to, let's say, new-id. And if we look at the element, now it has an ID of new ID. Now if I keep this here and then I try to select by ID and I use app title again, it's not going to work because that's been changed. So let's change this to something else. We'll add a title attribute, and we'll just say shopping list. And a title will typically, if you hover over this, whatever the title is will show. All right, now, like I said, there's not always a property for that we can use. So there's also a set attribute method. So let's copy this down, and what we'll do is get rid of this, and we will just want to do .set attribute, and that's going to take in two things. The first is going to be the attribute you want to set. Let's just use class, and then what you want to set it to. So I'll say title, and if we look here, you see now class is equal to title. I could have said .class name equals title, so there's many ways to do the same thing, but I just want to show you that there's both get attribute and set attribute, and we'll talk more about this later as well. Now there's going to be times where you don't want to type all this out. Like if you have to use this selector more than once, you might want to put it into a variable. So we can do that by just setting a variable and then setting this to get element by ID and app-title. So now if I were to console log title, then that's going to give us the element. Now I know that this video is showing you these different selectors, and we've only looked at get element by ID. We're going to look at query selector next, but I want to show you some of the things that we can do when we bring these in, when we grab an element from the DOM. All right, and we'll go into some of this stuff more in depth later on, but one of the things you'll do is you either want to get or change or add the content that's within that element. right? So what we could do is say, well, let's console log first title, which is our element, our title element, and we could do text content, which is a property that will get the content inside of it. In this case, you can see shopping list. Okay. Now we can also change it as well by saying title.text content and setting that to something else. Let's just say hello world. Save that. Now you see we've changed that element's text. There also is inner text. So if I say inner text like that, and we'll just set it to hello again, that'll basically do the same thing. There are some differences between these two, but I'm not going to get into that right now. You'll most commonly see inner text, at least in my experience. Now, if you want to use HTML tags, then there's a property called inner HTML. So you'll use this a lot with vanilla JavaScript. But with this, I could set it to, let's add some strong tags, and we'll just set it back to shopping list. So we'll say shopping list. Let's close our strong tag and save that. And now you can see now it's strong or bold. So another thing we can do is change styles. So we can actually edit our CSS from here. So for example, if I say title dot and then we use style and then whatever CSS property we want. So for instance, color, I'm going to set that to red. And you'll see I can change that color to red. Now it's important to know that if your style has, if your property has two words, like let's say background color, in CSS you would do this, right? Dash color, background dash color. You can't have a hyphen here. So in JavaScript, what you do is just use camel case like that. And then let's just set that to, we'll say black. Okay, and then maybe you want to add some padding, so we could change the property here to padding and set that to, let's say 10 pixels, right? And then we'll just do a border radius, say border radius, so it's two words, so it's camel case. Now you might be saying, well, why the hell would I want to use JavaScript to edit styles? Well, you wouldn't do it like this just to edit a static page, styles on a static page. When you want to have your interface be dynamic, that's when you do this type of thing. So for example, if you want to have a pop-up, if I were to hit this button and have something pop on the screen, a modal, you would be changing or adding CSS to your JavaScript, okay? Or you would just change classes. You would change a class to like show or hidden or whatever, and we'll get into that later. But I just want to show you now that you can select elements from the DOM and then you can change things or add or remove whatever you want. Okay, so you have full control of your interface through JavaScript and the DOM. So now we're going to move on to the other selector that you'll use for single elements, and that is document.querySelector. Now this was a game changer when it came out. Before that, if you're using vanilla JavaScript, we had to use getElementById. So whatever you selected, you had to have an ID on. And in some cases, you didn't have full control of the HTML. So that's where jQuery came in and gave us a big advantage, because we could select anything. We could just select an H1 with no class or attribute. We could select by class. We could select by anything at all. So that's really what QuerySelector gives us. And this came along with the ES6 or ES 2015 update and kind of put jQuery out of business as like a DOM manipulator. So let's start off by we'll do a console log here, and let's say document dot and then QuerySelector. There's also QuerySelector all, which is for multiple elements, and we'll get into that next in the next video. But if I want to select just by the selector, I can do that. So H1. And you'll see it's showing our H1 along with all the styling and all the stuff we did up here to it. Now, remember, this only selects single elements. That's kind of the difference between jQuery and this. If I did this with jQuery, it would select, I believe it would select all H1s. I haven't used it in so long, but I believe it would select all of them. In this case, it's going to select only the first one if there are multiple on the page. All right, but usually you're going to use this to select like a class or something like that, something that you know there's only one of. Otherwise, you'll use QuerySelector all. So another thing we could select by is ID. So we could say app-title. Okay, so that's going to log the same thing, the H1 with that ID. We can select by class. So if I say dot container and we select that, you can see that we get the container. And you can do all this same stuff with query selector, right? You can change styles, content, and all that. We could even do it by attributes. So for instance, if we want to get the input that has a type of text, we could say input, and then in brackets here, I could say type equals text. Actually, that takes quotes, I believe. Okay, and if I go ahead and log that, you can see now it's grabbing this input here. Now we can even use pseudo selectors. So basically anything you can use within CSS. So let's get rid of this. And instead I'm going to say a list item. If I do this, it'll just give me the first list item by default. Let's say I want the second list item. So I could say li, and I could use the pseudo selector of nth-child and pass in here 2. So that should give me the second list item, which is orange juice. And let's we'll do the inner text. Save that, and there we go, orange juice. So you can select and you can target anything on the page you want. So let's do this. Let's take the document query selector and the inner text, and let's put that into a variable. So we'll say const, and I'll call it second item. And we'll set it to that. Okay, so that'll give us the inner text. Actually, you know what? Let's not do the inner text because I just want the element. And then let's set the inner text. So we'll say second item and then dot inner text. And let's set that to, let's say, apple juice. If I save, now we get apple juice. Okay, if I wanted to change the color of it, then I could take the second item and change the color. Sorry, we need style. So style dot color and set that to red. All right, and I would encourage you to maybe, you know, after this video, try and change some things around with what you've learned. Try to change this interface up. Maybe change the color of the button, change the text of the button, things like that. Now, another thing that I want to mention is that you can use these methods on other elements other than the document. So for example, let's select the entire UL. So we'll say list, and then we'll set this to, let's say, document.query selector, and we're going to select the unordered list, okay, which is just this right here, right? Apples, apple juice, Oreos, etc. So that gives us the entire UL. If I console log list, it gives us the UL. Now, if I want to select something in that list, like say the first item, we can use query selector on list, okay? It doesn't have to be on the document. So let's take list, and then let's say query selector, and let's say we want to get, we'll just get the first list item, and yeah, we'll just do that. And then let's actually put that into a variable. We'll just call it, we'll call it first item. So first item equals that, and then we'll take first item, and let's change we'll just change the color. We'll say dot style dot color and set that to blue. Save, and now you see apples is now blue. So you can use query selector on any element. It doesn't have to be just on the document. All right, now in the next video, like I said, we're going to get into selecting multiple items.